In the spring of 1897, a man walked back into a town he had vanished from 3 years earlier. He arrived on foot, just after dawn, wearing clothes that didn't belong to him. His face was weathered beyond his years. His hands trembled when he tried to speak, and when the sheriff asked him where he'd been, he said only one thing: "Don't look for the others." His name was Thomas Gradle. He was 28 years old, and according to every record available, census documents, church registries, testimonies given under oath, he had disappeared without a trace on the night of October 14th, 1894, along with 6 other people from the mining settlement of Ashford Bend, located in the remote highlands of eastern Oregon. This is what we know. Ashford Bend was not a town in any formal sense. It was a collection of wooden structures built along a narrow river valley, surrounded by dense forest and steep ridges. The land was hard. The winters were brutal. The summer heat cracked the soil. It was a place people came to because they had nowhere else to go. Most of the residents worked in the timber industry or scratched out a living from small plots of rocky land. There was no post office, no telegraph line. The nearest incorporated town was Ridgefield, over 30 miles south by Wagon Road, and that road was often impassable during the rainy season. The population in 1894 was estimated at 43 people, including children. Thomas Gradel had arrived in Ashford Bend 2 years prior, in the autumn of 1892. He came alone. He carried a canvas pack, a bedroll, and a leather-bound journal that he never let out of his sight. He took work at the sawmill, kept to himself, and rented a small room above the general store run by a widow named Estelle Mundy. According to her testimony, given years later to a county investigator, Thomas was quiet but not unfriendly. He paid his rent on time. He didn't drink. He wrote letters that he never mailed. She said he seemed like a man trying to forget something. In the spring of 1894, he began spending time with a family named Carver, Henry Carver, his wife Nora, and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Henry worked as a teamster, hauling cut timber down to the rail depot in Ridgefield. Nora kept a small garden and took in laundry. The children were homeschooled by Nora, who had been a school teacher before moving west. Thomas would visit the Carver house on Sunday afternoons. He would help Henry repair tools, chop firewood, mend fences. He read to the children from his journal. Stories, he said, though no one ever saw what was written inside. Estelle Mundy said Thomas seemed lighter during those months, almost happy. Then came October. The first sign that something was wrong appeared in the records of the Ridgefield General Store, a ledger entry dated October 12, 1894. It noted that Henry Carver had come into town 2 days earlier than his usual schedule and purchased an unusual quantity of lamp oil, canned goods, and rope. The clerk remembered him because Henry asked if anyone had been through town recently asking about Ashford Bend. No one had. Henry paid in cash and left without explanation. 2 days later, on the evening of October 14th, a logger named Martin Cray was returning to Ashford Bend after a week working a distant claim. He passed the Carver house just before dusk and later told investigators that he saw lamplight in every window, an odd detail, since lamp oil was expensive and the family was known to be frugal. He also said he heard singing, not hymns, not folk songs, something he couldn't place. He described it as a sound like children singing, but the melody didn't go anywhere. It just repeated. He didn't stop. He continued to his own cabin a half-mile up the valley. The next morning, October 15th, Estelle Mundy opened the general store as usual. Thomas Gradle did not come down for breakfast. She knocked on his door. No answer. She opened it with her spare key. The room was empty. The bed had not been slept in. His journal was gone. She walked to the Carver house. The door was ajar. The inside was silent. No fire in the stove. No smell of cooking. No voices. The house was empty. Henry Carver, Nora Carver, their 3 children, Thomas Gradle, and one other person, a drifter named Samuel Hook, who had been staying in a tent near the river and was known to help Henry with heavy work. 7 people, gone. The investigation began slowly. Ashford Bend had no law enforcement of its own. A deputy from Ridgefield rode up 3 days later, after Estelle Mundy sent word with a passing traveller. He searched the Carver house, Thomas's room, and the surrounding area. He found no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture. The Carvers' belongings were still in place, clothes in the drawers, dishes in the cupboard, a pot of cold stew on the stove, but there were details that didn't fit. In Thomas Gradle's room, the deputy found a single sheet of paper pinned to the wall above the bed. On it, written in pencil, were 3 words: "They are listening." And in the Carver house, in the children's bedroom, someone had drawn a series of marks on the wall in charcoal. Vertical lines, evenly spaced, stretching from floor to ceiling. 37 marks, in total. No one knew what they meant. The case was filed as a disappearance. The report noted that the missing individuals may have fled due to debt, fear of prosecution, or personal crisis. It also noted that no evidence of foul play had been discovered. The file was closed in December 1894, and then, 3 years later, Thomas Gradle walked back into town. To understand what happened in Ashford Bend, we have to go back further, to the months before the disappearance, when the patterns first began to show themselves in the details left behind. Thomas Gradle's life before Oregon remains largely unknown. The few letters found among Estelle Mundy's belongings after her death in 1921 suggest he came from somewhere in the Midwest, possibly Illinois or Iowa. He mentioned a sister in one letter, though he never named her. He wrote about a fire, though he never explained what burned. What is clear is that he arrived in Ashford Bend with the quiet determination of a man putting distance between himself and something he couldn't face. He took the room above the general store in late September 1892. Estelle later recalled that he paid 2 months' rent in advance, in silver coins that looked old. She said he barely spoke during that first winter. He would come down in the mornings, eat a simple breakfast, and walk to the sawmill before dawn. He returned after dark, went straight to his room, and wrote by candlelight until late into the night. She never asked what he was writing. In those days, in places like Ashford Bend, you didn't ask. But she did say this: he wrote like a man trying to remember something he was afraid he'd forget. The Carver family had been in Ashford Bend longer, since 1889 according to county land records. Henry Carver was originally from Pennsylvania. Nora was from Ohio. They had married young and moved west with the promise of work and land. Henry was a large man, broad-shouldered and strong, but those who knew him said he had a gentle way about him. He sang while he worked. He taught his sons to treat animals with kindness. He never raised his voice, even when the children misbehaved. Nora was educated, rare for a woman in that region at that time. She had attended a teacher's college in Cleveland before the family fell on hard times. She kept books in the house, volumes of poetry, a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, a medical almanac from 1880. She taught the children to read and write using a slate board she had brought with her from Ohio. Their eldest son, William, was 10 years old in 1894. The second son, Charles, was 7. The daughter, Margaret, was 5. Neighbors described them as a close family. They attended community gatherings. They helped others when they could. Nora baked bread for the elderly loggers who lived alone in the valley. Henry lent tools freely and never asked for them back. But in the summer of 1894, something shifted. In late June, Henry Carver abruptly stopped attending the informal Sunday gatherings that the men of Ashford Bend held near the river. These gatherings were not religious. They were simply a chance to rest, trade stories, and share tobacco. When asked why he'd stopped coming, Henry said only that he needed to spend more time with his family. In July, Nora stopped sending the children to play with the other children in the settlement. A woman named Clara Denton, who lived a quarter-mile downriver, later testified that she asked Nora if something was wrong. Nora smiled and said, "We're just being careful." Clara didn't know what that meant. In August, Thomas Gradle began visiting the Carver house regularly. At first, it seemed natural. He had no family of his own, and the Carvers were kind people. But Estelle Mundy noticed that Thomas started coming back to his room later and later, sometimes well after midnight. She asked him once if everything was all right. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Do you ever feel like something is waiting for you?" She didn't understand the question. He never explained. There were other details, small and strange, that only became clear in hindsight. In early September, Henry Carver purchased 3 new locks from the general store. Heavy iron locks, the kind used on root cellars or storage sheds. Estelle sold them to him and asked what he needed them for. He said he was reinforcing the doors. She didn't ask why. Later that month, a traveler passing through Ashford Bend reported that he had stopped at the Carver house to ask for water. He said Nora answered the door, but didn't open it fully. She passed him a tin cup through a gap of only a few inches. He said she looked tired, but not unfriendly. He also said he heard Thomas Gradle's voice inside the house, speaking quietly to the children. The traveler didn't think anything of it at the time. The last confirmed sighting of the family together in public was on October 7th, 1894, exactly 1 week before the disappearance. Henry Carver brought his wagon into Ridgefield to deliver a load of timber. He stopped at the general store and spoke with the owner, a man named Amos Pritchard. Amos later told investigators that Henry seemed distracted. He kept looking out the window as though expecting someone. Amos asked if he was waiting for someone. Henry said, "No, just making sure." Before he left, Henry asked Amos a strange question. "If you had to leave town quickly, where would you go?" Amos thought he was joking. He laughed and said, "Depends on what I'm running from." Henry didn't laugh. He paid for his supplies, loaded his wagon, and left. That was the last time anyone outside Ashford Bend saw him. Back in the settlement, the days grew shorter. The autumn rains began. The forest around the valley darkened early each evening, and the mist clung to the ground long after sunrise. Thomas Gradel stopped working at the sawmill on October 10th. The foreman noted it in his log. Gradel did not report. No explanation given. Estelle saw him leave the general store that morning with his journal tucked under his arm. He walked toward the Carver house and didn't return until the following day. When he came back, she said he looked like he hadn't slept. She asked if he was feeling ill. He said, "I'm fine, just trying to help." She asked what he meant. He didn't answer. On the evening of October 13th, the night before the disappearance, Martin Cray was walking back to his cabin after a day of logging. He passed near the Carver house and saw Thomas Gradle standing outside in the yard, facing the tree line. Cray called out to him. Thomas didn't respond. Cray walked closer and called again. Thomas turned slowly. Cray later said his expression was blank, as though he had been somewhere else entirely. Cray asked if he was all right. Thomas said, "Do you hear it?" Cray listened. He heard nothing but the wind moving through the trees. Thomas nodded, as though that answered something, and went back inside the house. Cray continued home. He didn't think much of it. The next night, they were all gone. October 14th, 1894 began like any other day in Ashford Bend. The sun rose pale and cold over the ridgeline. Mist hung low in the valley. The air smelled of damp wood and earth. By mid-morning, the men had gone to work, some to the sawmill, others into the forest with axes and saws. The women tended to their homes. The children, those who weren't helping their parents, played near the river, but the Carver house remained silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. No one emerged to draw water from the well. The door stayed closed. Estelle Mundy noticed, but she didn't think it unusual. Families sometimes kept to themselves. Perhaps Nora was unwell. Perhaps the children were being kept inside because of the cold. She went about her day. It wasn't until evening that the strangeness began to settle over the valley, like a weight. Martin Cray returned to Ashford Bend just before dusk. He had been working a claim several miles upriver and was tired, hungry, and looking forward to sleep. He took the road that passed directly in front of the Carver house. The first thing he noticed was the light. Every window glowed with lamplight, bright, steady, unnatural for a family that rationed oil carefully. It was as though someone had lit every lamp in the house at once. The second thing he noticed was the sound. Singing. He couldn't make out the words. It wasn't loud, but it carried clearly through the still air. It sounded like children's voices, high and clear, repeating the same melody over and over. The tune didn't rise or fall. It didn't build toward anything. It simply circled back on itself, endlessly. Cray slowed his horse. He stared at the house. The door was closed. The curtains were drawn, but through the fabric, he could see shadows moving inside, figures passing back and forth in front of the lamps, slow and deliberate. He considered stopping, knocking, asking if everything was all right, but something about the scene made him uneasy. He couldn't say what. It was the kind of unease you feel when you see something that looks normal but isn't, a feeling that lives in the gut, not the mind. He urged his horse forward and continued up the valley to his cabin. He told himself he would check on them in the morning. The night deepened. The temperature dropped. A wind moved through the trees, low and constant, carrying with it the smell of rain. The sky was overcast, starless, the kind of night where sound travels farther than it should. Estelle Mundy was closing the general store when she realized Thomas Gradle had not come down for supper. She locked the front door, climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, and knocked on his door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She opened the door with her key. The room was empty. The bed was made. The small table by the window was clear except for a tin cup and a candle burned down to a stub. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. And his journal, the leather-bound book he carried everywhere, the one he guarded so carefully, was gone. Estelle stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the silence. Then she closed the door and went back downstairs. She didn't sleep well that night. She later said she kept waking, thinking she heard footsteps on the road outside. But every time she looked, there was nothing. What happened in the Carver house during those hours remains unknown. There were no witnesses. No one saw anyone leave. No one heard voices or shouts or anything that suggested distress. But we can reconstruct fragments. Small pieces of evidence left behind, details noted in the reports, testimony from those who entered the house afterward. The lamps had burned out by morning. The wicks were blackened. The oil reservoirs were empty. The stove was cold. A pot of stew sat on top, untouched, covered in a thin layer of congealed fat. In the main room, the table had been pushed to one side. The chairs were stacked against the wall. The floor was clear, swept clean. In the children's bedroom, the beds were made. The blankets were folded with care. And on the wall above the eldest boy's bed, someone had drawn those marks. 37 vertical lines in charcoal, evenly spaced, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. In Henry and Nora's bedroom, the drawers were open. Clothes had been removed. Not many, but enough to suggest someone had packed quickly. A small wooden box that Henry used to store money was found empty on the dresser. But the most telling detail was found in Thomas Gradle's room above the general store. Pinned to the wall above his bed was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in pencil in Thomas's handwriting, were 3 words. "They are listening." Below that, in smaller letters, almost as an afterthought, "We have to go now." The morning of October 15th arrived cold and grey. Estelle Mundy opened the store at dawn. She waited for Thomas to come down. When he didn't, she climbed the stairs again and found his room still empty. She walked to the Carver house. The door was ajar, not wide, just enough that the latch hadn't caught. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The silence was immediate and absolute. She called out. No answer. She moved through the house room by room, calling their names: Henry, Nora, William, Charles, Margaret, Thomas. Nothing. She went outside and walked to the tent by the river, where Samuel Hook, the drifter, had been staying. The tent was collapsed, half submerged in mud. Hook's bedroll was gone. His few belongings, a tin plate, a flask, a spare shirt, were scattered in the dirt. Estelle returned to the general store and told the others. By midday, every man in Ashford Bend had searched the area. They walked the roads. They checked the forest trails. They called into the trees until their voices went hoarse. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no abandoned belongings along the trails. It was as though 7 people had simply stepped out of the world. 3 days later, a deputy arrived from Ridgefield. He interviewed everyone in the settlement. He examined the Carver house. He read the note in Thomas's room. He studied the marks on the wall. He took notes, filed a report, and left. In his official statement he wrote, No evidence of foul play. Probable cause: voluntary departure due to unknown personal or financial crisis. Recommend case be closed, pending further evidence. The case was filed and forgotten. Winter came. Snow covered the valley. The Carver house stood empty, its door swinging in the wind, and for 3 years, no one heard from any of them. Until the morning Thomas Gradle walked back into town. He appeared on the road just after dawn on April 3rd, 1897. He was alone. His clothes were too large for him, as though they had been borrowed or taken from someone else. His hair was longer, tangled and dirty. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His hands shook when he tried to lift them. He walked slowly, deliberately, like a man who had forgotten how to move naturally. Estelle Mundy saw him first. She was sweeping the front steps of the general store when she looked up and saw him standing in the middle of the road, staring at the building. She dropped the broom. He didn't speak. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on the door. She called his name. He blinked as though waking from a dream and looked at her. And then he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Don't look for the others." Within an hour, word had spread through Ashford Bend that Thomas Gradel had returned. By midday, a crowd had gathered outside the general store. Men stood with their arms crossed, women whispered behind their hands, and children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted to know where he had been, what had happened, where the others were. But Thomas wouldn't speak. Estelle Mundy had brought him inside and sat him down at a table in the back room. She gave him water, bread, a bowl of soup. He ate slowly, mechanically, as though he had forgotten what hunger felt like. His hands trembled with every movement. She asked him gently, quietly, where he had been. He stared at the table and said nothing. She asked about the Carvers, about Henry, Nora, the children. He closed his eyes and shook his head. She asked if they were alive. He looked at her then, and she later said his expression was the saddest thing she had ever seen. Not frightened, not angry, just empty. He said, "Don't look for them." That was all he would say. The deputy from Ridgefield arrived 2 days later. His name was Frank Osborne, and he was the same man who had investigated the disappearance 3 years earlier. He was older now, grayer, and he carried himself with the weariness of someone who had seen too many cases go unsolved. He sat across from Thomas in the back room of the general store and asked the questions that needed to be asked. Where had he been for 3 years? Thomas stared at the wall and said, "In the woods." Osborne pressed him. "Which woods? How far? Why didn't he come back sooner?" Thomas said, "We couldn't." Osborne leaned forward. He asked carefully who "we" was. Thomas's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Osborne asked about the Carvers. Were they with him? Were they still alive? Thomas shook his head slowly, but it wasn't clear if he was saying no or simply refusing to answer. Osborne asked about Samuel Hook, the drifter. Was he there too? Thomas flinched at the name. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Osborne saw it. He asked again, "Was Samuel Hook with you?" Thomas looked directly at him for the first time and said in a flat, emotionless voice, "He told us to follow him." Over the following days, Osborne tried repeatedly to extract more information. He changed his approach, sometimes gentle, sometimes firm, sometimes silent, waiting for Thomas to fill the space. But Thomas gave only fragments, pieces that didn't fit together, answers that raised more questions than they resolved. He said they had walked north into the mountains. He said they had stayed in a place he couldn't describe. He said there were others there, people he didn't know, people who didn't speak. When Osborne asked why they went, Thomas said, "Because we had to." When Osborne asked why he came back alone, Thomas said, "Because I was told to." When Osborne asked who told him, Thomas closed his eyes and refused to say another word. A search party was organized. 12 men, including Osborne, left Ashford Bend on April 8th and headed north into the heavily forested highlands. They followed logging trails, game paths, and the rough descriptions Thomas had given, though his directions were vague and often contradictory. They searched for 6 days. They found nothing. No camps, no shelters, no signs of habitation, no graves. On the sixth day, one of the men, a logger named Peter Whitlock, claimed he saw something carved into the bark of a tree about 15 miles north of Ashford Bend. He called the others over. It was a series of marks, similar to the ones found on the wall of the Carver children's bedroom. Vertical lines, evenly spaced. Whitlock counted them. 37. Osborne asked if anyone recognized the area. No one did. The forest was dense, the terrain difficult. There were no trails nearby. It seemed an unlikely place for anyone to have been. They marked the tree and continued searching. They found nothing else. They returned to Ashford Bend on April 14th, exhausted and empty-handed. Thomas Gradle remained in town, staying in his old room above the general store. Estelle Mundy watched over him, though she said later that it felt less like caring for a guest and more like watching over someone who was already gone. He barely spoke. He ate little. He spent most of his time sitting by the window, staring out at the road. But at night, Estelle said, she could hear him moving around, pacing. Sometimes she heard him talking, not loudly but steadily, as though he were having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. One night, unable to sleep, she stood outside his door and listened. He was reciting something. Not a prayer, not a poem, just words, repeated over and over in a low, rhythmic cadence. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but she said it sounded like a warning. On April 22nd, a man arrived in Ashford Bend asking about the Carver family. His name was Joseph Carver, and he identified himself as Henry Carver's younger brother. He had traveled from Pennsylvania after receiving a letter, months old, informing him of the disappearance. Osborne met with him and explained what little was known. Joseph listened quietly, his face drawn and pale. When Osborne finished, Joseph asked to speak with Thomas Gradel. Estelle brought him upstairs to Thomas's room. Joseph knocked and entered. They spoke privately for nearly an hour. When Joseph emerged, his face was ashen. He left the general store without speaking to anyone and rode out of town that same evening. Estelle asked Thomas what they had talked about. Thomas looked at her and said, "I told him not to look for them." She asked why. He said, "Because they're not his family anymore." In the weeks that followed, small details emerged. Rumors, mostly, passed between neighbors and travelers. A woman in Ridgefield claimed she had seen Nora Carver in late 1894, walking along the road heading north. She said Nora looked tired but calm. She said there were others with her, though she couldn't say how many. A trapper working the high country reported finding a shelter, a rough lean-to built against a rock face, sometime in the winter of 1895. Inside, he found a child's shoe, a tin cup, and a piece of cloth with the initials WC stitched into the corner. William Carver. He left the items where he found them and never returned to that area. And in June 1897, a stagecoach driver passing through a town 50 miles north of Ashford Bend swore he saw a man matching Samuel Hook's description standing at the edge of the forest, watching the road. The driver said the man didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there perfectly still until the stage was out of sight. When asked if he was certain it was Hook, the driver hesitated. Then he said, "He looked like him, but something was different. Something in the way he stood, like he was waiting for something." Thomas Gradel remained in Ashford Bend through the summer. He took no work. He spoke to no one unless spoken to. He seemed to be waiting for something, though no one knew what. Then, on the morning of September 9th, 1897, he was gone. Estelle Mundy found his room empty. The bed was made. His few belongings were gone. And on the table, weighed down by a stone, was a folded piece of paper. On it, in his handwriting, was a single sentence, "I have to go back." Beneath that, hastily scrawled, as though added at the last moment, "They're calling." Thomas Gradel was never seen again. No further searches were conducted. Deputy Osborne filed a final report stating that the case remained unsolved and that all parties involved were presumed deceased or permanently missing. The Carver house stood empty for another decade before it was dismantled for lumber. The marks on the bedroom wall were never explained. And to this day, no trace of Henry Carver, Nora Carver, their 3 children, or Samuel Hook has ever been found. More than a century has passed since the events in Ashford Bend. The settlement itself no longer exists. The sawmill closed in 1903. The families moved on. The buildings fell into disrepair and were eventually reclaimed by the forest. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find the foundations, moss-covered stones half buried in the earth, rusted nails scattered in the undergrowth, the faint outline of a road that leads nowhere. The valley is silent now. The river still runs through it, cold and clear. The trees are tall and thick, and in the autumn, when the mist rolls in and the light fades early, it looks much as it did in 1894. But the people are gone, and the questions they left behind remain unanswered. Over the years, theories have been proposed. Some believed the group fled due to debt or legal trouble, that they staged the disappearance to escape creditors or the law. But no records have ever surfaced, suggesting financial hardship or criminal activity. Henry Carver was known to be honest and hard-working. Thomas Gradel had no known debts. The theory, while plausible, lacks evidence. Others suggested a religious or cult-like influence, that Samuel Hook, the drifter, may have convinced the others to follow him into isolation, perhaps as part of a fringe belief system. The repetitive singing heard by Martin Cray, the strange marks on the walls, and Thomas's cryptic statements about being told to do things all lend weight to this idea. But again, there is no documentation of Hook's beliefs, no witnesses to sermons or rituals, no evidence of a group forming around him. There is also the possibility of foul play, that someone harmed the group and concealed the crime. But the lack of physical evidence, the absence of blood or signs of struggle, and Thomas Gradel's return 3 years later all argue against this. If they were murdered, where are the bodies? Why did Thomas come back? And why would he warn others not to search? The truth is, we simply don't know. And perhaps that is the point. What we do have are the fragments they left behind. The note in Thomas's room. They are listening. The marks on the wall. 37 lines carefully drawn, repeated in the forest 15 miles away. The testimony of Martin Cray, who heard singing that looped endlessly, without resolution. The words Thomas spoke to Deputy Osborne. He told us to follow him. And his final message before vanishing a second time. They're calling. These are not the remnants of a crime. They are not the traces of an accident. They are the language of something else. Something that exists in the spaces between what we can explain and what we can prove. They are the sound of people who believed they heard something, saw something, felt something that demanded a response. And whether that something was real or imagined, external or internal, hardly matters in the end, because they followed it, and it took them somewhere we cannot go. In 1923, a historian named Margaret Hollis traveled to eastern Oregon to research forgotten settlements of the late 19th century. She came across the Ashford Bend case in the county archives and became fascinated by it. She interviewed the few surviving residents, those who had been children in 1894 and were now elderly. Most remembered little. A few recalled the disappearance but had no new information to offer. One woman, however, a daughter of Martin Cray, told Hollis something her father had never included in his official testimony. She said that on the night of October 14, 1894, after her father had passed the Carver house and heard the singing, he had trouble sleeping. He kept waking, thinking he heard the same melody carried on the wind. Around midnight he got up and walked to his window. He looked out toward the valley, toward the direction of the Carver house, and he saw lights. Not lamplight from windows, not campfires. Lights moving through the trees, slowly, deliberately, in a line. He counted 7. He watched them until they disappeared into the forest, heading north. He never told anyone because he didn't know how to explain what he'd seen. He assumed eventually that it had been a dream. But his daughter said he never went into the northern forest again. Not once, in all the years that followed. When asked why, he would only say, "Because some places don't want you there." Margaret Hollis published a small monograph on Ashford Bend in 1925. It received little attention. The case was too old, too obscure, too frustratingly incomplete to capture the public imagination. But she ended her account with a reflection that has stayed with those few who have read it. She wrote, "We tell ourselves that disappearances must have explanations, that people do not simply vanish, that the world operates according to rules we understand. And most of the time, we are correct. But every now and then, a case comes along that resists our certainty, that sits quietly in the archives, gathering dust, refusing to be solved. The people of Ashford Bend did not disappear into violence or tragedy. They disappeared into silence. And perhaps that is more frightening than any answer we could find. Because silence does not argue with us. It does not justify itself. It simply waits. And if you listen carefully, in the places where they were last seen, you might hear it still. That faint, tuneless melody circling back on itself, never quite ending. And you might wonder, as I have, whether it was ever meant for us to hear at all. The forest still stands. The valley is still quiet. And somewhere in the archives of an Oregon County courthouse, in a box marked Unsolved, 1894, there is a file that contains everything we know about what happened in Ashford Bend. A deputy's report, a sketch of the marks on the wall, a transcript of interviews, a single sheet of paper with 3 words written in pencil. It is not much, but it is enough to remind us that the world is larger than we think, that there are doors we do not see, and paths that lead beyond the edges of our maps, and that sometimes people walk through those doors, and they do not come back. In 2003, a hiker exploring the highlands of eastern Oregon reported finding something unusual about 18 miles north of where Ashford Bend once stood. It was a clearing, small and circular, surrounded by old-growth trees. In the center of the clearing was a stone cairn, a pile of rocks stacked carefully, deliberately as though marking something. The hiker dismantled part of the cairn and found, buried beneath the stones, a leather-bound book. The pages were brittle, water-damaged, and mostly illegible. But on the inside cover, written in faded ink, was a name, Thomas Gradle. The hiker turned the book over to the local historical society. Experts attempted to preserve and read the remaining pages, but the damage was too severe. Only a few phrases could be made out, scattered and fragmentary. Not what we thought. They showed us, we cannot leave. And on the final page, written in a different hand, smaller, shakier, as though written by someone very young, were 4 words. We are still here. The book is now kept in a climate-controlled archive in Portland, Oregon. It is labeled as an artifact of unclear origin, possibly connected to the Ashford Bend case, though no definitive link has been established. Researchers have examined it. Historians have studied it. And no one has been able to explain how it ended up buried in the forest, miles from anywhere, more than a century after it was last seen. But there it is, a voice from the past, speaking across the years, telling us perhaps the only thing that matters. They are still there, somewhere in the silence, somewhere in the trees, waiting. And if you ever find yourself walking through the forests of eastern Oregon, in the places where the old maps no longer match the land, and you hear something in the distance, a melody that doesn't quite resolve, a sound that circles back on itself, don't follow it. Don't look for the source, just turn around and walk away, because some warnings are given only once,